The wolves came out of the red rock like smoke. Miranda Kane's horse skidded in the sand of Sable Junction Mesa as a gray blur slammed past her stirrup. The air was full of dust snarling and the high tearing cry of a child. 20 yards ahead, a small Apache girl stumbled in the open knees, bloody braids flying. 3 wolves circled her teeth, bared one already dragging a dead jackrabbit that had lured them close. Miranda did not think. She shoved her mare between the girl and the pack, grabbed the child's wrist with her left hand, and raised her colt with her right. The nearest wolf lunged all ribs and fury. The revolver roared. Sand and hair flew. The rest of the pack fanned out, some flinching from the smoke, others twisting in for another charge. Miranda dragged the girl tight against her side. Together, they backed through the swirling dust, one woman, one child, ringed by gray bodies and snapping jaws in the shadow of the mesa. It looked for a long breath, like the desert itself had decided to eat them. The largest wolf, scarred across the muzzle, crouched low and gathered itself. Miranda could see the muscles bunch beneath its patchy coat. She fired again. The bullet kicked dirt into the creature's eyes. It yelped and wheeled away, and the rest of the pack followed, melting back into the rocks as suddenly as they had appeared. The silence that followed was broken only by the child's ragged breathing and the nervous stamp of Miranda's mare. Miranda holstered her colt with shaking hands and looked down at the girl clinging to her skirt. The child's face was streaked with tears and dust, her dark eyes wide with terror. And something else, something that looked almost like hope. Miranda's heart was still hammering against her ribs. She had not come to this country looking for trouble, and she certainly had not expected to find herself standing between a pack of starving wolves and an Apache child in the middle of nowhere. But here she was, and the choice had already been made. "Can you ride?" Miranda asked, her voice hoarse. The girl nodded, though her legs were shaking so badly, Miranda doubted she could stand on her own. Miranda lifted her onto the mare's back, then swung up behind her. The horse protested the extra weight, but obeyed when Miranda urged her forward. As they rode away from Sable Junction, Miranda glanced back once. The wolves were still there, visible as gray shadows against the red stone, watching, waiting. The desert was like that, always watching, always waiting, always ready to swallow the weak and the unlucky. Miranda tightened her arm around the trembling child and turned her face toward home. The mesa behind them glowed rust red in the afternoon sun, and the wind carried the scent of sage and dust. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk screamed. Miranda felt the weight of the child against her chest, felt the small hands clutching her sleeve, and wondered what she had just brought into her life. They made it out alive, but only just. The wolves peeled off when the carcass was left behind, and the gunfire kept booming. Miranda's horse limped flank, torn by a grazing claw. The girl's name, she learned once they reached Miranda's rough cabin near Drought Creek, was Nayeli. She spoke only a little English enough to say "mother" and point back toward the red rock country where the sun was falling. Miranda was a stranger in this land herself. A widowed cattle hand from back east who had traded a bad marriage for a land claim, she lived alone in a one-room cabin of rough pine overlooking the only reliable bend of Drought Creek. Her husband had been a cruel man, quick with his fists and slow with his promises. When he died kicked by a horse, he had been beating Miranda, had taken what little money remained, and fled westward looking for a place where no one knew her name or her shame. She had filed her claim 3 years ago, built the cabin with her own hands, and some help from neighbors, and learned to shoot well enough to keep the coyotes from her chickens and the drifters from her door. The work was hard, the isolation complete, but it was hers. That mattered more than comfort. Her closest neighbor was 3 miles downstream, a poor immigrant farmer named Giuliano, who irrigated a patch of corn with a handmade sluice. The Italian had arrived 2 years before Miranda, fleeing some trouble in New York that he never spoke of. He was a quiet man with gentle hands and a nervous smile, and he had helped Miranda raise the beams of her cabin when she first arrived. He spoke broken English and sang Italian songs while he worked, and sometimes Miranda would hear his voice carrying across the flats on still evenings. The cabin itself was modest, one large room with a stone fireplace, a rope bed in the corner, a rough-hewn table and shelves lined with tin cans and sacks of flour. The windows were covered with oiled paper that let in light, but kept out the worst of the wind. Outside, a small corral held Miranda's mare and a stubborn mule. Beyond that, the land stretched flat and golden toward the distant mesas broken only by the thin green line of Drought Creek winding through the scrub. She knew there was tension with the local Apache band that drifted along the high country. The big rancher Aldrich Kincaid had been fencing off more range every season. The sheriff in the nearby town of Lantern's End folks called him Disloyal Dan, paid bounties on raiders, and the saloon talk said most of the bodies turned in were not raiders at all, just people in the way. Kincaid was a man of influence, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, with a kind of confidence that came from owning more land than he could see from his porch. He had arrived in the territory a decade earlier with Eastern money and political connections, buying up water rights and grazing land, until half the county depended on his goodwill. His ranch house sat on a hill overlooking Lantern's End, like a feudal keep, and his men rode the range with the authority of soldiers in occupied territory. Miranda had seen him only once at the land office, where he had tried to buy her claim for a pittance, and once in town, where he had looked through her as if she were made of glass. Sheriff Dan Harrow was Kincaid's creature, though he pretended otherwise. A lean man with a drooping mustache and cold eyes, Dan had been elected on promises of law and order. But everyone knew the only law he enforced was Kincaid's. He wore a tin star and carried a rifle, and he had a habit of showing up wherever trouble was brewing with a posse of hard men at his back. Miranda had heard stories about families driven off their claims, about accidents that happened to people who stood in Kincaid's way. She had also heard whispers about bounties paid for Apache scalps, though no one would say such things aloud where Dan might hear. Still, Miranda had never fired on a native person, and she had never expected to find an Apache child alone, half-starved and weeping in the path of a wolf pack. She took Nayeli in, cleaned her cuts, wrapped her in a spare shirt, and set a tin cup of beans in front of her. The girl ate like she had not seen a meal in days, shoveling the food into her mouth with both hands, pausing only to cough or wipe her eyes. Miranda watched her in silence, trying to piece together what had happened. The child's clothes were torn, her feet cut and bleeding. She had been running for a long time, that much was clear. But from what and where was her family? Nayeli finished the beans and looked up at Miranda with solemn eyes. She pointed to the west toward the high country and said a word in Apache that Miranda did not understand. Then she said in halting English, "Men, guns, mother." She trailed off, her face crumpling. Miranda's stomach tightened. She had heard the stories. Kincaid's men had been clearing the range, driving off squatters and native families alike. Some said it was legal, backed by contracts and county proclamations. Others said it was murder dressed up in paperwork. "Where is your mother?" Miranda asked gently, though she already feared the answer. Nayeli shook her head and buried her face in her hands, small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Miranda did not press. She made up a pallet by the fire and settled the girl down for the night, and then sat at the table with her Colt disassembled, cleaning each piece with methodical care. Her hands moved automatically, a habit from years of cattle work, where a clean gun meant the difference between eating and starving. Outside, the wind whispered through the scrub, and somewhere far off, a coyote howled. Miranda listened to the night sounds and tried not to think about what tomorrow might bring. In town the next morning, Miranda reported the attack to Dr. Joseph Hale and Hattie the schoolteacher, who doubled as a part-time clerk. Joseph was a middle-aged man, with kind eyes and a slight stoop of the kind of doctor who treated everyone regardless of their ability to pay. He had sewn up Miranda's hand once, after she cut it on barbed wire, and he had refused payment, saying only that neighbors helped neighbors. Hattie was younger, sharp-tongued and sharp-eyed, with ink-stained fingers, and a habit of speaking her mind, even when it got her into trouble. She had tried to teach Miranda to read better, lending her books and newspapers, though Miranda's schooling had ended at age 12. Their faces tightened when they heard the child was Apache. Joseph warned quietly, "Kincaid's men have been riding hard this week. Watch who you tell." Hattie leaned close and whispered, "There have been rumors. Families gone missing. Cabins burned. Dan says it is raiders, but no one believes him anymore." Outside the telegraph shack, a group of rough men in dust-stiffened coats studied Miranda and the girl from under their hats. One of them, a red-bearded fellow folks called Angry Andy, spat chew in the dust and said, "Looks like Kane brought herself home a bounty." Miranda felt the girl flinch behind her skirt. She turned and met Andy's gaze without blinking. "She is a child," Miranda said evenly. "Not a bounty." Andy grinned, showing brown teeth. "Kincaid might see it different. County says all Indian miners are wards. That means they belong to whoever reports them." Miranda's hand drifted toward her hip, where her colt rested under her shawl. "She does not belong to anyone," Miranda said. "Least of all Kincaid." Andy's grin faded. He glanced at his companions, then back at Miranda. "You are making a mistake, Kane," he said softly. "A big one." Miranda bought supplies with the last of her credit and left town quickly, Nayeli's hand clamped tight in hers. On the ride back to the cabin, she could feel eyes on her back the whole way. The road was empty, the sky a pale, washed-out blue, and the heat pressed down like a hand. Miranda kept the mare at a steady trot, her free hand resting on the butt of her colt, ready. That night, she bolted the door and slept with her colt under her pillow. Nayeli curled up by the fire, whimpering in her sleep. Miranda lay awake, listening to the wind and the creak of the cabin walls, and wondered what she had brought down on herself. The answer came sooner than she expected. They did not have to wait long for the child's people. 2 nights later, when the moon was a thin hook over the mesa, riders appeared on the ridge above Miranda's cabin. They came down without torches, moving like shadows. The lead warrior dismounted at her fence rifle, cradled low palms open, but watchful. He was tall and lean, with a rawhide headband and dark hair clubbed back at his neck. There was a faded bullet scar along his ribs where his shirt gaped. His face was hard, and weathered lines etched deep around his mouth and eyes the face of a man who had seen too much death and not enough justice. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, the eyes of a man who had survived by being smarter and faster than his enemies. Nayeli bolted from the doorway. When she saw him, grabbed his belt and started speaking in a rush of Apache. He listened without interrupting his gaze, never leaving Miranda's face. His expression did not change, but Miranda saw his shoulders ease slightly, saw the way his hand moved away from the knife at his belt. His name was Takala. He was Nayeli's mother's younger brother. Their family had been running from a group of white riders when the wolves took the girl's trail. By the time Takala doubled back, he had found only trampled brush wolf prints and a trail of blood that vanished in the sand. He had searched for 2 days, following every track, every broken branch, expecting at each turn to find her body. He had come for the child, wary and ready to hate whoever held her. But Nayeli's fingers dug into Miranda's sleeve, and she refused to let go. In halting English, she said, "She shoot wolves. She not bad." Takala studied Miranda across the small flare of the fire. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his shoulders that spoke of barely leashed violence. "You live on our water," he said at last, his English slow but clear. You carry our child. The men who chased her, wear your coats." Miranda met his eyes. She did not look away, did not flinch. She had learned in her years of surviving alone that showing fear was the fastest way to invite trouble. "The creek is not Kincaid's," she answered, "and those men are not mine." For a moment the night was silent, except for the crackle of the fire. Then Takala nodded slowly, as if coming to some internal decision. "You saved her," he said. "For that I am in your debt." Miranda shook her head. "You owe me nothing. She is a child. Anyone would have done the same." Takala's mouth twisted bitterly. "No," he said. "Not anyone." He gestured to the other riders waiting in the shadows. "We have lost 12 people this season. Shot hanged, driven into the desert to die. The white sheriff pays for our bodies like they are coyote pelts." Miranda felt a chill run through her, despite the warmth of the fire. She had heard rumors, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that gossip never could. "I am sorry," she said quietly. Takala shrugged. "Sorry does not bring back the dead." He glanced at Nayeli, and his expression softened slightly. "But it kept one alive. That is something." Before they could decide anything more, hoofbeats thudded in the distance. A lantern bobbed on the ridge. Sheriff Dan's posse with Angry Andy at the front were coming fast, their shouts carrying across the flats. Takala's hand went to his rifle. Miranda grabbed Nayeli and pulled her behind her. "Go," she said to Takala. "Take her and go." But Takala did not move. His eyes were on the approaching riders, calculating distances and angles. "If I run, they will hunt us. If I stay, they will kill us all." Miranda's mind raced. She could hear the shouts now, the jingle of harnesses. The posse was less than a minute away. She made a decision that would change everything. "Then we fight," she said. Takala looked at her surprised. For the first time, something like respect flickered in his eyes. He nodded once, then moved to the corner of the cabin, where the shadows were deepest rifle ready. Miranda stepped out onto the porch, Colt in hand, and waited for the storm to break. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her hands were steady. She had faced down drunk cowhands and wild cattle and her husband's fists. She could face this too. The sheriff rode into the yard with 6 men and the rattling confidence of someone who believed the law wore his face. "Kane," he called, reining in his horse just beyond the firelight. "You are harboring an Indian miner, county ward by proclamation. Hand her over nice and peaceable, and we will see she is placed proper." Behind him, the men fanned out hands near pistol butts. Their faces were hard and eager, the faces of men who enjoyed their work too much. Nayeli shrank behind Miranda. Takala slipped back to the shadows by the woodpile, knife, ready eyes moving from rifle to rifle. Miranda knew what placed proper meant with these men. She also knew they wanted more than the girl. If Dan could rescue an Apache child from a lone woman on a prime piece of creek, he could declare both child and land in the county's guardianship and sell the water rights straight to Kincaid. It was a neat trick. It looked lawful in the books and profitable in practice. "No," Miranda said. "She is with her uncle. He is taking her home." Dan's gaze ticked to the darkness and back. "There is no Indian here," he said loudly for his men. "Just a murderer hiding behind a woman. You are aiding raiders, Kane. That is a hanging offense." "She is a child," Miranda repeated, her voice hard. "Not a raider, not a ward, and you have no authority to take her." Dan's smile was thin and cold. "I have all the authority I need." He nodded to Angry Andy. "Take the girl. If the woman resists, arrest her." The yard exploded into motion. One of the posse lunged for Nayeli. Miranda clubbed him across the jaw with her Colt, then fired a warning shot into the dirt between Dan's boots. The horse reared, nearly throwing him. From the shadows, Takala's rifle cracked, knocking another man off his horse with a scream. Wolves howled far off, stirred by the gunfire. Horses spooked, bucking and wheeling. In the chaos, Miranda grabbed a saddlebag, stuffed with supplies. Takala snatched Nayeli, and the three of them dove for Miranda's lame mare and Takala's pony. Bullets hissed after them as they pounded away toward the high country, leaving the cabin and everything Miranda owned behind in smoke and shouting. The flight was brutal. Miranda's mare stumbled twice, favoring her injured flank, and each time Miranda thought they would be caught. But Takala knew the land. He led them through a maze of arroyos and dry washes, doubling back and crossing their own trail until even Miranda was disoriented. The moon was thin, the stars cold and distant, and the desert stretched around them like an ocean of darkness. Behind them, the posse's shouts faded into the distance, but Miranda knew they would not give up. Dan had his reputation to protect, and Kincaid had his plans. They would keep coming, relentless as the wolves. As dawn broke over the desert painting, the mesa's gold and crimson Takala finally called a halt in a narrow canyon choked with boulders and scrub. They dismounted and led the horses into the shade, then collapsed against the rock, gasping. Miranda's legs shook. Her lungs burned. Nayeli was pale and shaking, but unhurt. Takala checked her over with quick, efficient hands, then looked at Miranda. "You should not have done that," he said. Miranda wiped sweat from her face. "I had a choice," she said. "I made it." Takala studied her for a long moment. Then he reached into his pack and pulled out a strip of dried meat, which he handed to Nayeli. The girl ate mechanically, her eyes distant, still locked in shock. "They will not stop," Takala said. "Not until we are all dead or gone." Miranda nodded. She had known that the moment she pulled the trigger. "Then we keep moving," she said. Takala's expression was grim. "Where?" Miranda thought of the cabin, the land, the waters she had fought so hard to claim. All of it was gone now. Lost the moment she chose to stand between a child and a man with a star on his chest. But she did not regret it. She had made her choice with open eyes, and she would live with the consequences. "Somewhere they cannot follow," she said. Takala almost smiled. "There is no such place." Miranda met his eyes. "Then we make one." Their flight across the mesa was the beginning of a hard, thin trail that would test them in ways none of them expected. They crossed open prairie by night, keeping to washes and mesquite to dodge Dan's posse. Once caught in a dry arroyo as dawn broke, they had to lie flat while riders passed along the rim above. Miranda felt the sand filter into her collar, felt Takala's hand press lightly on the back of her boot to keep her still. It was the first time she noticed his touch as something more than practical, a reminder that she was not alone, that someone else was watching her back. The realization unsettled her more than the grit in her teeth. The posse was relentless. Dan had split his men into two groups, one following their trail and the other circling wide to cut them off. Twice, they nearly rode into an ambush. The second time, Takala spotted the glint of a rifle barrel in the rocks and jerked Miranda's reins hard to the left. Bullets whined past her ear, close enough that she felt the heat, close enough that she tasted copper in her mouth. They returned fire and spurred their horses into a dead-run Nayeli, clinging to Takala's back like a burr. The chase lasted until nightfall, when they finally lost the posse in a maze of volcanic rock that even Takala barely knew. The horses were lathered and stumbling. Miranda's hands were blistered from gripping the reins. Nayeli had stopped crying hours ago, and now sat silent, face blank, lost somewhere inside herself. At a swollen bend of the river, they nearly lost the girl. The only crossing was a fallen cottonwood, slick with mud and moss. Takala went first, leading the horses with a rope tied to his belt. He turned back, hand out to Nayeli. The girl took a step, slipped, and fell. Miranda lunged without thinking, catching the back of Nayeli's dress with one hand and the log with the other. Her shoulders screamed in protest, old muscles tearing. Takala, stranded midway, extended his rifle for Miranda to grab. For a moment, the three of them hung in a crooked chain, above the brown water suspended between safety and disaster. Miranda could hear the river roaring beneath them, could feel the dress tearing in her grip. Then Takala braced his feet and pulled. Miranda hauled with her free hand. Inch by inch, they shuffled the girl across their breath, coming in ragged gasps. When they finally collapsed on the far bank, soaked and shaking, Miranda found herself laughing a harsh, desperate sound that was half sob. Nayeli clung to both of them, her small body trembling. Miranda found herself stroking the girl's hair, murmuring soft reassurances in a voice she barely recognized as her own. Takala wrung out his shirt and kept watch. But Miranda noticed the way he glanced at her, something unreadable in his eyes. For a few stolen minutes, they were just three people trying to survive, not fugitives or enemies or strangers. For a few stolen minutes, Miranda felt something she had not felt in years, the warmth of belonging. Later, in the mouth of an abandoned silver prospect along Whirlwind Pass, they thought they had found a hiding place. The tunnel was narrow and dark, the air thick with the smell of old rock and bat guano. They led the horses inside and built a small fire in the back, shielded from the wind. Instead of rest, they found trouble. Dan's men tracked them there, by the prints of Miranda's limping mare, the hoof prints clear as writing in the soft dust. Gunfire shrieked against rock. Powder smoke filled the narrow tunnel, choking and acrid. Takala and Miranda fought side by side, swapping weapons, when one ran dry without even looking. At one point, Miranda's Colt jammed, and Takala handed her his rifle without a word, taking the pistol to clear it while she kept firing. In one brief lull, he pressed a pouch of cartridges into her palm and their fingers brushing. "You shoot straight," he muttered. "You are not so bad yourself." She snapped back, feeling heat climb her neck despite the chill stone. They broke out by a narrow ventilation shaft that Takala remembered from years ago when his people had used the mines for shelter during the winter. They slid down shale into a ravine while bullets chipped sparks above their heads and the rock singing with near misses. Night found them on the move again, exhausted, hungry, and increasingly bound to one another by the simple math of survival. He knew the land. She knew the white men's law. Together, they stood a chance. Apart, they were already dead. On the third night, they camped in a cave, high above the desert floor, hidden behind a screen of juniper. Nayeli fell asleep almost immediately, curled up in Miranda's blanket, her face finally peaceful. Takala sat by the entrance rifle across his knees, watching the stars emerge one by one from the deepening blue. Miranda joined him, too tired to sleep. Her body ached in places she had forgotten existed. Her hands were torn and bleeding. But she was alive, and so were the people with her. That had to count for something. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Takala said quietly, "Why did you help her?" Miranda considered the question. It was not the first time he had asked, but this time it felt different, less like an accusation and more like genuine curiosity. "Because she needed it," she said finally. "Because I could." Takala nodded slowly. "My sister Nayeli's mother was killed 2 days before the wolves came, shot by men with badges. They said she was stealing cattle." His voice was flat, emotionless, but Miranda could hear the rage beneath it, banked like coals waiting for fuel. She was gathering firewood. Miranda's chest tightened. "I am sorry," she said. Takala looked at her. Or are you just sorry it happened to people you know? Miranda met his gaze. I am sorry it happened at all, she said. And I am sorry I did not know sooner. I am sorry I did not do more. Takala studied her for a long moment, then nodded. You are different, he said. Most white people, they see us and they see animals, or ghosts, or a problem to be solved. But you see people. Miranda did not know what to say to that. She looked down at her hands, rough and calloused from years of hard work, scarred from barbed wire and hot branding irons. I see what is in front of me, she said. That is all. Takala almost smiled. That is more than most. They sat in silence for a while longer, listening to the wind and the distant howl of coyotes. Then Takala said, We cannot run forever. Dan will not stop. Kincaid will not stop. Sooner or later, they will corner us. Miranda nodded. She had been thinking the same thing. Then, we need a reason for them to stop, she said. Takala raised an eyebrow. What reason? Miranda thought of the cabin, the land, the water. She thought of Giuliano and Joseph and Hattie, good people trying to live in a bad situation. She thought of Nayeli, orphaned, and hunted for no reason other than the color of her skin and the greed of powerful men. Proof, she said. Proof that Kincaid is behind all of this. Proof that Dan is his puppet. If we can get that to the circuit judge. Takala cut her off with a sharp gesture. The judge is Kincaid's man too. Everyone knows it. Miranda shook her head. Maybe. But there is a new judge coming through Lantern's End next week, a federal man. I heard about it in town before all this started. If we can get evidence to him, Kincaid cannot bury it. Takala looked skeptical. What kind of evidence? Miranda thought of the stories she had heard in town, the whispers about bounties and contracts and backroom deals. She thought of the way Dan had avoided looking at Joseph when the doctor asked about missing families. Records, she said. Ledgers. Anything that ties Kincaid to the killings. Takala snorted. And where do we find such a thing? Miranda smiled grimly. Kincaid's ranch. Takala stared at her. Then slowly he began to laugh. It was a harsh, bitter sound, but there was a spark of something else in it. Something like hope, something like respect. You are insane, he said. Miranda shrugged. Probably. Takala shook his head, still smiling. If we do this, we will likely die. We will likely die anyway, Miranda pointed out. Takala considered that. Then he nodded. True, he said. At least this way we die doing something useful. They shook on it, their hands clasping in the darkness. Miranda felt the rough calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. It was the grip of a man who had fought for everything he had and refused to give up. It was the grip of someone she could trust with her life. She realized with a jolt of surprise that she did trust him. Completely. Somewhere in the chaos of gunfire and flight, somewhere between the river crossing and the mine shaft, they had become something more than allies. They had become partners. And maybe she thought with a flutter in her chest that felt almost like fear, something even more than that. The twist came in a dusty line shack on the edge of Kincaid's range, and it changed everything. They slipped inside looking for food and blankets. The shack was empty, abandoned for the season, with a pot-bellied stove and a narrow cot covered in mouse droppings. But there was a desk in the corner, and in the desk a ledger bound in cracked leather. Under the wavering light of a stolen lantern, Miranda turned the pages, while Takala watched the door. Names, dates, tallies of beef and barbed wire. And another column written in a tighter hand, Indian bounties. Each line had a number and a brief note. Family at Ghost Town, spring cleared. Riders at Upper Creek ambushed. Woman and 2 children near Red Bluff disposed. The sum at the bottom had Aldrich Kincaid's immaculate signature, and below it, paid via Sheriff D. Harrow. Miranda felt her stomach turn to ice. She had suspected, had heard the rumors, but seeing it written down in cold ink made it real in a way that gossip never could. These were not accidents or misunderstandings. These were murders planned and paid for, signed and sealed like any other business transaction. There was more. A map showed Drought Creek with a pencil sketch of a dam high in the canyon. A scribbled note in Kincaid's handwriting read, "Once completed all upstream access hours. Natives and squatters starved out. Projected completion 8 weeks." Nayeli, peering over Miranda's shoulder, suddenly jabbed a finger at a line 3 pages back. She did not know the English words, but she recognized the date and the mark. Kincaid's foreman used a small X with a circle around it. "Mother," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Mother here." Miranda found the line, "Woman with child, ghost town, spring cleared. Bounty paid $15. The date was 2 weeks ago, the day Nayeli's mother had died. Miranda's hands shook as she turned the pages. There were dozens of entries going back months. Families erased like chalk from a slate. Children orphaned or killed. Old people driven into the desert to die of thirst. All of it legal, all of it signed off by the county, all of it profitable. "They pay themselves to kill us," Takala said flatly, reading over her shoulder. "Then they dam the water and finish what the bullets miss." For the first time, he looked at Miranda not as an intruder, but as someone trapped in the same jaws. "Your cabin sits where their dam must be weak." He went on, his voice hard. "They cannot own the creek while you stand on it. That is why Dan came for you. Not because of Nayeli, because you are in the way." The Ledger turned their flight into a mission. If they could put it in front of the circuit judge due in Lantern's End within the week, Kincaid's empire could crack. If they failed, the dam would rise, the Apache camp downstream would be drowned or starved, and Miranda would be brushed aside like everyone else who had stood in Kincaid's way. Miranda stared at the pages, her mind racing. Everything made sense now: the bounties, the harassment, Dan's relentless pursuit. It was not about law or justice or even hatred. It was about water. It was always about water. In this country, water was life. Control the water and you controlled everything. Takala was right. Her cabin sat on the weakest point of the proposed dam. If she held the land, Kincaid could not build without her permission, and if the Apache camp stayed upstream, they could cut off his water supply. Together, the two groups were a threat to everything Kincaid had planned. So he had decided to remove them. Quietly, legally, with bounties and proclamations, and a sheriff who looked the other way. Miranda felt a cold fury settle in her chest. She had lost everything: her cabin, her land, her livelihood, because one man wanted a little more water and a little more power. And he had done it by turning neighbor against neighbor, white against native law, against justice. But now she had proof. Cold, hard, undeniable proof. And if she could get it to the right person, she could tear Kincaid's empire down around his ears. "We take this to the judge," she said. Takala nodded. "And if the judge will not listen?" Miranda looked at him, her eyes hard. "Then we make him listen." Takala's mouth quirked in a grim smile. "I like the way you think." They spent the rest of the night in the line shack, taking turns keeping watch. Miranda studied the ledger until she had memorized every entry, every name, every damning detail. Nayeli slept fitfully, whimpering in her dreams, and once she woke, crying for her mother. Miranda held her until she fell back asleep, rocking her gently, whispering soft words that meant nothing and everything. As dawn approached, Takala touched Miranda's shoulder. "We should go," he said softly. Miranda nodded and closed the ledger carefully. She tucked it into her saddlebag, wrapping it in oilcloth to protect it from the weather. Then she followed Takala out into the cold gray morning, Nayeli walking between them. They were halfway to the horses when they heard the shout. There by the shack. Riders poured over the ridge, a dozen men led by Angry Andy. They had been waiting, watching, and now they had their quarry trapped in the open with nowhere to run. Takala grabbed Nayeli and threw her onto his pony. Miranda swung onto her mare and kicked the animal into a gallop. Bullets whined past her head, one so close it tore through her shawl. Takala returned fire, his rifle barking in the cold air, and one of the riders went down screaming. They rode hard, pushing the horses to their limits. But Andy's men were fresher, better mounted, and they were gaining. Miranda could hear them shouting behind her, could hear the thunder of hooves getting closer and closer. "Split up," Takala shouted over the wind. "Meet at the canyon." Miranda nodded and veered left, drawing half the posse after her. She heard Takala's rifle crack again, and then the thunder of hooves as he rode in the opposite direction with Nayeli clinging to his back. For the next hour, Miranda played a deadly game of cat and mouse with Andy and his men. She led them through gullies and over ridges, doubling back and circling until she was dizzy with exhaustion. Her mare was frothing at the mouth ribs, heaving, and Miranda knew the animal could not keep this up much longer. Then she saw it, a narrow slot canyon barely wide enough for a horse. She spurred the mare into the gap and followed it as it twisted and turned, the walls rising higher and higher on either side, until the sky was just a thin ribbon of blue above her. Behind her, the posse's shouts echoed off the stone, amplified and distorted. The canyon ended in a rockfall, a jumble of boulders blocking the way forward. Miranda dismounted and scrambled up the loose stone, dragging the mare behind her. Her lungs burned. Her legs shook. She could hear Andy's voice close now, shouting orders to his men. She reached the top just as the first rider entered the canyon below. She did not hesitate. She fired 3 shots into the unstable rockfall above them, and the whole thing came down in a roar of dust and stone, sealing the canyon behind her and burying at least 2 men in the avalanche. She did not wait to see if anyone was buried. She mounted the mare and rode hard for the canyon, where she had agreed to meet Takala, praying he had made it out alive, praying she had not just doomed them all by stealing the ledger. Going back to town felt like walking into a noose, and in a way, it was. They slipped into Lantern's End at dusk, leaving Nayeli with a trusted elder of Takala's band on a hill above the town. The old woman, whose name was Amma, held the girl close and promised to keep her safe. Nayeli did not want to let go of Miranda, clinging to her with desperate strength, but Miranda knelt down and looked her in the eyes. "I will come back for you," Miranda said. "I promise." Nayeli searched her face, then nodded slowly. "You come back," she whispered. "You not leave, Nayeli." "I will not leave you," Miranda said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Miranda took the ledger to Dr. Joseph and Hattie in the empty schoolhouse. It was late, the town quiet, and the schoolhouse smelled of chalk dust and old paper. Both went pale as they read, their faces drawn and shocked. Hattie whispered, "If a judge sees this, Kincaid is finished. Dan, too. Maybe half the county government." Joseph nodded, his hands shaking as he turned the pages. "This is murder," he said softly. "Plain and simple. Murder for profit." But Kincaid had ears everywhere. Giuliano, sweating and torn between gratitude for Miranda's past kindness and fear of losing his lease, had already been pressed by Kincaid's foreman earlier that day. The foreman had made it clear, if Giuliano saw anything, heard anything, he was to report it. If he did not, his land would be forfeit, and he would be run out of the territory. When Giuliano saw Miranda and Takala in town, flanked by Joseph and Hattie, he knew which way the wind was blowing. He knew what was in that ledger, or at least he could guess. And he knew that Kincaid would find out one way or another. So he did what he thought he had to do. He slipped away and told the foreman, and the foreman told Dan. They were waiting when Miranda and Takala stepped out into the street. Lamplight glared on drawn revolvers. A dozen men, maybe more, ringed the schoolhouse with rifles at the ready. Dan stood in the center, his face hard and cold in the flickering light. "Kane," Dan announced, his voice carrying across the empty street. "You are under arrest for harboring savages and conspiracy against lawful landowners. The Indian is wanted for horse theft and murder." Takala did not reach for his weapon. 2 rifles had him dead to rights, and he was too smart to throw his life away on a gesture. Miranda could only watch as they dragged him to the makeshift jail and shoved her into the sheriff's office. The ledger was snatched from her hands by Andy, who grinned at her with vicious triumph before delivering it straight to Kincaid's safe in the big house on the hill. Miranda was thrown into a cell with iron bars and a dirt floor. She paced like a caged animal, her mind racing. She had been so close. The judge was due tomorrow, and now the only evidence was locked in Kincaid's safe, and she was locked in a cell. By noon the next day, a crowd had gathered in front of the jail. Someone had already set up a barrel and a rope on the cottonwood outside. Dan stood on the porch, stoking their anger with lies about raids and murders and savages who needed to be taught a lesson. The crowd muttered and shouted, whipped into a frenzy by Dan's rhetoric and the promise of blood. Miranda was dragged from her cell and shoved through the crowd to the base of the tree. Takala stood on the barrel, hands tied behind his back, the noose rough against his throat. His face was bruised, his lips split, but his eyes were clear and defiant. Dust swirled in the hot wind. Hattie and Joseph pushed through the throng helpless, their faces stricken. Miranda forced her way to the front, shoving past men who grabbed at her. She climbed onto the barrel behind Takala under the pretext of saying goodbye. The crowd jeered, but Dan allowed it, smirking at the spectacle. Close enough that only he could hear Miranda pressed her forehead briefly against the back of his shoulder and whispered, "I am not leaving you on this tree." He did not answer, but his shoulders eased a fraction. For a heartbeat, their breathing fell into the same slow rhythm, 2 people stealing calm in the middle of a storm. She felt the warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart, and she knew in that moment that she would burn the whole town down before she let them hang him. Then Dan shoved her down again and kicked the barrel. The rope snapped taut, then jerked loose. Someone had cut it. Smoke billowed from the livery as horses screamed, the building erupting in flames. A second rope whipped across the street, tripping Dan's men like a lasso. In the confusion, a figure in a soot-smudged coat, Giuliano, slashed Takala's bonds with a knife. "Run!" Giuliano gasped, catching a bullet in the arm. Blood bloomed across his sleeve. "The judge is on the road. Kincaid rides for the dam. He will blow it tonight." The Italian collapsed, blood soaking through his sleeve and spreading across his shirt. Joseph and Hattie dragged him into the schoolhouse, while Miranda and Takala fought their way through the chaos. Angry Andy appeared from the smoke pistol, raised his face, twisted with rage. Miranda shot him in the leg, and he went down screaming, clutching his thigh. They stole 2 horses from the panicked crowd and thundered out of town, the crowd's shouts fading behind them. On the hill above, Nayeli waited with Amma, eyes wide with fear. Takala swept her up onto his horse without stopping, and they rode hard for the canyon, the sun sinking behind them like a dying ember, the sky turning the color of blood. They had only hours before Kincaid blew the canyon apart. Miranda, Takala, and Nayeli rode through the gathering dusk, the horses lathered and stumbling. Behind them, they could hear the distant rumble of hoofbeats, Dan's remaining men and Kincaid's private army converging on the dam site. Joseph and Hattie had promised to bring the judge as soon as he arrived, but there was no guarantee they would make it in time. The dam loomed ahead, a crude structure of timber and stone spanning the narrowest part of the canyon. It was half finished, but already it held back a swollen reservoir of brown water that pressed against the supports with visible force. Lanterns bobbed along the top of the dam, and Miranda could see men moving back and forth, carrying bundles that could only be dynamite. Kincaid was going to blow the supports on the upstream side, collapsing the dam just enough to flood the Apache camp and wash away Miranda's cabin site. Then he would rebuild, claiming the disaster as natural, and the water rights would be his. They left the horses in a stand of cottonwood and approached on foot. Rain began to spit from a sky the color of old iron as thunder rolled off the mesas. The storm was coming fast, which meant visibility would be poor good for them, bad for shooting. Takala touched Miranda's arm. "I will go high," he said, pointing to the cliff path above the dam. "Cut the fuses. You go low, stop the men from lighting more." Miranda nodded. "And Nayeli?" "She stays hidden," Takala said firmly. But Nayeli shook her head, her small face set with stubborn determination. "I help," she said. "I not hide." Takala started to argue, but Miranda put a hand on his arm. "Let her watch," she said. "She has earned that much, but she stays back behind cover." Takala looked like he wanted to protest, but he nodded curtly. He knelt down and spoke to Nayeli in rapid Apache, then kissed her forehead. The girl hugged him tightly, then scurried to a protected hollow in the rocks where she could see but not be seen. Miranda and Takala split without another word, moving into the storm with the practiced coordination of people who trusted each other completely. Miranda crawled along a low ledge under the lip of the dam. Fingers numb on wet rock, a coil of rope cinched around her waist. The stone was slick with rain and moss, and twice she nearly lost her grip. Below her, the river churned and roared, swollen with runoff. One slip and she would be swept away. Takala climbed the slick cliff path above, hugging the face of the canyon while bullets sparked around him. He moved like a ghost, using every crack and shadow. But the men on the dam had spotted him. Rifle fire cracked through the rain chips of stone flying. On the ground, Joseph and a recovered Giuliano had arrived with a handful of men from town farmers and shopkeepers who had grown sick of Kincaid's rule. They traded shots with Kincaid's men from behind boulders, buying Miranda and Takala precious seconds. Giuliano, pale and clutching his bandaged arm, fired with grim determination. At one point, he took a round through the thigh and slumped, cursing in Italian. But he kept firing from where he lay. Nayeli, hidden in her hollow, watched with wide eyes. She saw a lit fuse snaking toward a powder crate near the lower spillway, the flame hissing and spitting as it ate through the cord. Without thinking, she darted out of cover, her small hands clawing at the fuse. Dan, battered, but still on his feet, saw her and swung his rifle. "Little savage," he snarled and pulled the trigger. Takala, halfway up the cliff, could not get a clear shot. He shouted once, a raw sound ripped by the wind, and started down in a desperate half-slide that sent rocks skittering. Miranda, seeing Dan's rifle swing toward the child, yanked her safety rope tight and lunged off her ledge, swinging herself between the gun and Nayeli like a pendulum. The shot tore splinters from the canyon wall, inches from Miranda's face, the bullet so close she felt the heat scorch her cheek. She crashed into Dan, knocking him sideways, and the two of them rolled on the wet planks, grappling for the pistol that had fallen from his holster. Nayeli stomped the lit fuse out with her bare heel, hissing as sparks burnt her skin, then scrambled back to cover. Miranda and Dan fought viciously, all pretense of civilization gone. He was stronger, but she was desperate. She clawed at his eyes, drove her knee into his ribs, and when he tried to choke her, she bit his hand hard enough to draw blood. He roared and threw her off, but she rolled and came up with his pistol in her hand. "It is over, Dan," she gasped. He looked at her, blood running from his nose, and laughed bitterly. "Nothing is over," he said. "Kincaid owns this territory. You think one ledger changes that?" "It is a start," Miranda said, and shot him in the shoulder. He went down screaming, and she kicked his rifle away. Above, Takala had reached the main bundle of cords, feeding every charge on the dam. With fingers stiff from rain and cold, he sawed through them with the belt knife he had carried since boyhood. The knife was old, the blade worn thin, and for a terrible moment he thought it would break. But the leather cords parted one by one, and the fuses went limp and dark. One charge, however, had already been lit on the far side, a backup Kincaid had placed personally. The flame was halfway down the line, burning steadily despite the rain. Takala sprinted along the top of the dam boots, slipping on wet timber. He could see Kincaid below, shouting orders, his silver hair plastered to his skull. The rancher looked up and saw Takala coming, saw the knife in his hand, and drew his pistol. They met in the center of the dam, in a clash of violence. Kincaid fired twice, missing both times in his haste. Takala tackled him, and they went down together on the slick planks, rolling perilously close to the edge. Kincaid was older, but heavier, and he fought with the desperate strength of a man who had everything to lose. He drove Takala back toward the edge, hands locked around his throat. "You will die here, savage," he snarled. "You and every one of your filthy kind." Takala's vision swam, but he managed to get a knee between them and shove. Kincaid staggered back, and Takala lunged for the burning fuse. He grabbed it with his bare hand, the flame searing his palm, and yanked it free from the powder keg. Kincaid bellowed and charged at him, driving him back. They grappled at the very edge of the dam and the river churning 30 feet below. Takala could feel his boots slipping, could feel the void behind him. Then a shot cracked from the rocks. Giuliano, pale and shaking, had dragged himself up onto an outcropping with Joseph's help. He did not hit Kincaid, but he did what mattered. One of the dam's support braces, already weakened by the partial blast, splintered under the impact. The half-built spillway shuddered and began to collapse, dumping a sheet of water and wood into the channel below. Kincaid lost his footing as the planks buckled beneath him. He grabbed at Takala, then at Miranda as she scrambled up from below. For a second, he hung onto her coat by sheer weight, dragging her toward the edge. She could feel herself sliding, could feel the void opening beneath her. Takala lunged from above and grabbed Miranda's wrist with both hands. "Hold on," he shouted over the roar of the water. Together they held on as Kincaid's grip slipped from Miranda's coat inch by inch, his fingers clawing for purchase. His eyes met Miranda's wide with disbelief and terror. Then he fell backward into the churning river, his scream cut short as he vanished in the foam and broken beams. Some dynamite still went off in a muffled boom where wet fuses had only half failed. A surge of water roared downstream, a wall of brown fury 6 feet high. But the dam itself held enough that the Apache camp warned by signal fires, and Takala's riders had scrambled to higher ground in time. Teepees sagged and were swept away. Horses were lost, and one elder was swept away, despite the warnings, but most of the people survived. On the dam, Miranda and Takala lay side by side, chests heaving, Nayeli wedged between them, clutching both their sleeves with small, strong hands. Rain washed blood and powder from their faces. Thunder rolled overhead. No one said anything. They did not need to. Below, Dan, wounded and disarmed, tried to crawl away. Joseph and Hattie, who had arrived with the circuit judge and his military escort, blocked his path. The judge himself, a stern man in a dark coat with a silver beard, stood over the wreckage with a grim expression, flanked by 2 soldiers with rifles. "Arrest that man," the judge said, pointing at Dan, "and someone find me that ledger." Hattie stepped forward, pulling a water-stained ledger from her bag. Dr. Hale retrieved it from Kincaid's safe during the fire. she said. "Everything is here." The judge took the ledger and began to read, his face darkening with each page. When he finished, he looked up at the assembled crowd, townspeople, farmers, Kincaid's former men, and Takala's warriors watching from the ridge above. "This is a dark day," the judge said, "but it is also a day of justice." By dawn, the storm had blown east, leaving the desert washed clean and smelling of wet sage. Soldiers escorting the circuit judge secured the town and began taking statements. Joseph presented the ledger, now slightly singed but intact. Giuliano, pale on a stretcher, swore under oath about the dam and the bounties, and Kincaid's orders, his voice weak but steady. Hattie produced a stack of unpaid tax notices showing how much of the town Kincaid had quietly bought through intimidation and fraud. Dan tried to claim self-defense, tried to argue that he was just following county law, but too many eyes had seen too much. He was stripped of his badge on the spot and taken away in irons, cursing and spitting. Some of Kincaid's men were arrested as well, though others slipped away into the desert and were never seen again. Kincaid's body washed up 3 miles downstream the next day, his fine boots filled with mud, his silver hair matted with blood and silt. In his soaked coat, the judge's men found the map of Drought Creek and the forged water rights contract he had planned to present, along with a stack of territorial bonds and a small derringer. The Apache band came down to the river's edge to meet the judge 2 days later. There were no grand speeches, only hard questions and short answers translated by Joseph, who had learned some Apache over the years. The warriors stood with rifles slung, but ready, the women behind them, with children clinging to their skirts. The mood was tense, wary, but hopeful. In the end, there was no formal treaty. Washington was too far away and the territorial government too weak, but there was a written agreement the judge signed and stamped with his official seal. No dam on Drought Creek, without the consent of its inhabitants, white and native alike. The Apache camp would have legal access to the Upper Canyon and the springs. Miranda's land claim was recognized and protected. The water would be shared. The document was thin as a biscuit and twice as brittle, and everyone knew it might not survive the next territorial governor or the next wave of settlement. But it was more than they had before. It was a start. Takala stood apart during most of this, arms folded, watching the white men argue and negotiate with the patience of someone who had buried too many kin to believe in paper promises. When it was over, he walked with Miranda along the riverbank, while Nayeli skipped ahead chasing dragonflies that hovered over the water. "You will stay," Takala said. It was not quite a question. "I have nowhere else worth the trouble," Miranda replied. "Besides, someone has to keep an eye on your water." He snorted softly. "Our water." He corrected, then glanced at her, the corner of his mouth almost smiling. For the first time, she realized he no longer looked past her when they talked. He looked at her, really looked at her with warmth and something deeper that made her heart skip. Miranda felt heat climb her neck. "Our water," she agreed softly. They walked in silence for a while, comfortable in each other's presence in a way that felt both new and ancient. Nayeli ran back to them holding a dragonfly cupped in her hands, its iridescent wings catching the light. She showed it to Miranda, her eyes bright with wonder and joy. Miranda smiled and touched the girl's hair gently. "Beautiful," she said. Nayeli beamed and ran off again, releasing the dragonfly to watch it dart away. Takala watched her go, his expression softening in a way Miranda had never seen before. "She has had too much loss," he said quietly. "But she is strong, like her mother." Miranda nodded, her throat tight. "She will be all right," she said. "We will make sure of it." Takala looked at her, something unspoken passing between them, a promise, an understanding, a shared future neither of them dared to name yet. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said. "We will." His hand found hers as they walked rough and warm. Miranda's fingers curled around his, and they stood together by the river, watching the water flow past, watching Nayeli chase butterflies in the morning light. Weeks later, the desert had settled back into its familiar silence. But everything had changed. Miranda rebuilt her cabin with help from Giuliano, who now worked his own strip of land instead of Kincaid's lease. The Italian's wounds had healed slowly, leaving him with a permanent limp, but his spirit was lighter than Miranda had ever seen it. He sang while he worked old songs from his village, and sometimes Nayeli would try to sing along in her broken Italian, making them all laugh. Dr. Joseph and Hattie visited on Sundays, bringing books for Nayeli and medical supplies for both camp and cabin. Hattie had started teaching Nayeli to read and write, and the girl was proving to be a quick study. Joseph tended to the sick and injured on both sides, traveling between town and camp, with his black bag becoming a bridge between two worlds. The Apache band moved their main camp closer to the high springs above Drought Creek, driving their ponies along a path that skirted Miranda's fields in a wide, respectful curve. Takala's people built their shelters in the traditional way, using willow frames and hides, and the smoke from their fires rose thin and blue into the desert sky. The wolves still howled at night, but now Miranda heard them as part of the country's rough music instead of a promise of death. Her mare healed slowly the scars on her flank, fading to white lines. Nayeli learned to split kindling and string a fishing line, laughing when she outfished Miranda in the creek, her small face glowing with pride. One clear evening, as the sun dropped behind Black Mesa and the air turned sharp with the promise of autumn, Miranda returned from checking her snares and stopped short at the edge of her property. Her cabin was surrounded, not by riders with guns, but by Apache families standing in a loose circle beyond the fence. Ponies snorted their breath white in the cooling air. Children clutched bundles. Women held blankets and baskets. Warriors stood at the back, rifles slung but easy in their hands. Every face was turned toward the cabin door. For a heartbeat, Miranda's chest seized a visceral memory of the night Dan had ridden down her fence. Then she saw Takala step forward from the crowd, unarmed Nayeli running beside him with a smile that could light the desert. Without a word, the people began to lay things at the edge of her porch. A tanned elk hide, soft as butter, and worked until it glowed. A pair of beaded moccasins in Nayeli's size, the beadwork intricate and beautiful. A carved water gourd polished by many hands until it shone like amber. A small bow and a quiver of arrows fletched with hawk feathers. Even a woven belt knife sheath, far finer than anything Miranda had ever owned, the patterns telling stories she could not yet read but longed to learn. Takala held out a short, broad-bladed knife with a handle wrapped in dyed leather, red and black and gold. "From my father," he said, his voice formal but warm. "For the woman who stood against wolves and men." Miranda took the knife with trembling hands, understanding the weight of what was being offered. This was not charity. This was acceptance. This was family. Behind Takala, the band's elder Ama, who had sheltered Nayeli, produced a folded, water-stained paper. It was the original contract granting Kincaid exclusive rights to Drought Creek, found snagged on a branch after the flood. She placed it in Miranda's hands with a gap-toothed smile and nodded toward the cabin stove. Miranda understood. Later that night, the flames would eat the last scrap of Kincaid's claim, turning his greed to ash and smoke. An older woman, her face lined with years and wisdom, stepped forward next and pressed a tiny beaded dress into Miranda's arms, so small it could only fit a child. For the child. Amma translated her English better than most. "It means you are her cabin mother whenever she is here. You are kin now." Nayeli, hearing this, threw both arms around Miranda's waist without hesitation, burying her face in Miranda's skirt. Miranda's hand found its way into the girl's hair fingers, curling there as naturally as if they had always belonged. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and unexpected, and she did not try to hide them. Takala watched them, his expression unreadable, but his eyes soft. Then he asked, his voice carrying across the gathering, "You will keep a fire for us." Miranda looked from him to the circle of faces weathered and beautiful in the fading light, to the gifts ringed around her door like promises carved in wood and leather, and finally back to the creek, flashing silver in the distance. She thought of all the paths that had led her here, the bad marriage, the long flight west, the wolves, the child, the fight for water and justice, and a place to belong. As long as there is water in that creek, she said, her voice steady and sure, "I will keep a fire." The people around her murmured approval, soft words in Apache that she did not understand but felt in her bones. Someone laughed, a bright sound like water over stones. Smoke from the cabin chimney rose straight into the evening sky, a column of white against the deepening blue. Later, after the band had departed and the gifts had been carefully arranged inside the cabin, after Nayeli had fallen asleep by the fire, clutching the beaded dress, Miranda stood on her porch and looked out at the desert. The moon was rising, painting the rocks silver and the shadows black. The creek murmured in the distance, steady and eternal, the sound of life itself. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Takala stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the firelight, holding 2 tin cups. He stepped out onto the porch and handed her one. It was full of water from the creek, cold and clean. They stood together in silence, sipping the water, watching the night deepen. After a while, Takala's hand found hers rough and warm and solid. Miranda's fingers curled around his, and she felt something in her chest ease some old wound, finally beginning to heal. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" he asked. "For trusting me," she said. "For letting me stand with you. For giving me a place to belong." Takala was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. Then he said, "You earned that trust. With blood and fire and courage, you earned your place here." Miranda nodded, blinking back fresh tears. "I will not let you down," she said. "I know," he replied simply. They stayed on the porch until the stars came out bright and cold and infinite. The desert stretched around them, vast and unforgiving, but no longer lonely. They had found something rare and precious in the midst of violence and loss, a place to belong and people to belong with. They had found each other. Far above, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky. The creek sang its endless song. The cabin glowed warm behind them, filled with gifts and promises, and the sleeping form of a child who had been saved by wolves, and by the woman who refused to let her face them alone. Miranda thought of the journey that had brought her here, of the choices made and the prices paid. She thought of the wolves circling in the dust, of Nayeli's terrified eyes, of the ledger and the dam, and the moment when everything could have been lost. She thought of Takala's hand in hers, warm and steady, a promise of something new and fragile and real. The last shot is a wide red desert bathed in moonlight, rebuilt cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. Apache ponies grazing peacefully near Giuliano's wagon, the thin, bright line of Drought Creek running through it all like a silver thread stitching the world together. Once Miranda had stood alone in this landscape, with a revolver and a crying child and a circle of wolves closing in. Now, when the sun sinks and shadows stretch long across the mesa, another circle forms around her cabin, a living ring of people who have chosen after blood and flood and ledger ink to stand together against the darkness. The gifts remain on her porch that night, catching the starlight like small, stubborn promises. The knife rests on the table inside a symbol of honor and acceptance. The water flows clean and free, shared as it should be. And in the warmth of the cabin, a child sleeps safely surrounded by love and protection. No longer hunted, no longer alone. They will never face the wolves alone again.